In this video, I'm going to talk about the 38 Super and the precursor to the 357 Magnum, which is the 3844 Smith and Wesson. Since the 38 Super was invented first, I'll begin there. First of all, if you read the Wikipedia article about the 38 Super, it will state that jacketed hollow points were not made for this cartridge until about 40 years after its creation. The source for this statement is an article in Guns magazine written by Masad Ayub. However, I have found an advertisement for some Remington 38 Super hollow points being sold at $4 for 100 rounds in August 1931, only 2 years after the cartridge was created. Many people seem to think that the 38 Super was invented to penetrate through thick metal of automobile bodies made at the time, which is obviously useful in a law enforcement context. However, I've seen no compelling evidence that the 38 Super was created specifically for law enforcement use or through penetrating through automobiles. This advertisement appeared in May 1929 of American Rifleman, and it obviously says that the 38 Super is ideal for big game and target shooting. It is the earliest advertisement for the 38 Super that I am aware of. I can show you other advertisements like this one from Outdoor Life that portrays the 38 Super as a bear defense gun, but I can't show you any advertisements from law enforcement magazines. From what I have read of Chicago's 1313 Police Journal and Michigan State Trooper magazine, there aren't any firearm advertisements at all. There was essentially no meaningful discussion about firearms either. This is a bit confusing to our modern perspective, which is very used to the latest and greatest firearms technology being marketed specifically towards law enforcement. I don't normally do this in gun videos, but I want to take a minute to explain some of the cultural background of this era. Obviously, there was different cultural perspectives that existed back then. The 1313 Police Journal, for example, frequently mentioned officers losing or gaining weight, and there were articles about overweight officers. That sort of thing doesn't exactly scream professionalism. Officers that don't seriously try to maintain a reasonable amount of fitness represent a certain kind of mediocrity. Another example of a lack of professionalism was an incident in where one sergeant was teaching another how to use a shotgun, and the sergeant that was receiving the teaching was clearly a safety hazard if the shotgun was loaded. This sort of situation would be viewed as an embarrassment to the department in our modern era, certainly not the sort of thing that you would put in a magazine for others to read. I think the reason that there wasn't much general interest in firearms expressed in this era among officers also reflected a lack of desire to have the best tools for the job, similar to the kind of mediocrity mentioned before about physical fitness. Obviously, officers today can still be mediocre both in fitness and in marksmanship, but we have standards that are higher today than they were back then. This was also an era in which eugenics was still being openly promoted, and it was thought that you could simply legislate the negative effects of alcohol out of existence with prohibition. The problem with prohibition is that whatever you prohibit, you actually remove any ability to use the law to regulate or to ensure that there is some level of safety that applies to the activity or item in question. Thanks to the short-sighted social engineering of the progressive era, alcohol was prohibited, and the result was an increase of organized crime and social decay. In an article originally printed in the American Journal of Police Science, Calvin Goddard remarks on the fact that any child or adult could buy a nice new handgun through the mail, yet during that era, violent crime was essentially non-existent. In comparison, when Prohibition was ongoing, people remarked on how dangerous it was to allow people to buy guns through the mail. The desire to control guns essentially only started when bad policies led to increased crime, so rather than dealing with the underlying issue, it became very popular to pursue gun control in a fallacious attempt to stop the rampant crime. Now that I'm done with that, the 38 Super is based on the dimensionally identical 38 ACP cartridge that came before it. The Colt 38 Super pistol and cartridge should be both viewed as an improved evolution and a direct replacement of the Colt Model 1902 chambered in 38 ACP. The military model of the 1902 was no longer made after 1928 because the 38 Super came out in 1929. The 38 Super was built on a 1911 frame and came with a 9-round magazine compared to the 8-round 1902 military model. On average, the 38 Super has more energy, velocity, and penetration than the 38 ACP. However, if we compare the standard 38 super loading to the most powerful 38 ACP factory loading available in 1929, we find that this 38 ACP load is more powerful. The standard 38 super load was more powerful than the most powerful factory 45 ACP load at the time. You will notice that all the 45 ACP loadings shown here are 200 grains. If I recall correctly, the original load for the 1911 was 200 grains, not 230 grains. Regardless, the 38 Super had considerably more penetration, more power, and more magazine capacity than the 1911, 9 rounds versus 7 rounds. We can also compare the 38 Super to the 7.63 Mauser C96. The Mauser was rather unwieldy and not particularly concealable or particularly easy to use. It was somewhat less powerful but had roughly equal penetration in wood. It had a 10-round internal magazine that took noticeably longer to load because loading was done with stripper clips. The 38 Super was seen as a valid alternative to other high-velocity handguns made at the time like Mausers and Lugers. Foreign guns like these were difficult to find parts for, were subject to high tariffs, and were more complicated than the simple Browning tilting breech action. The advantage of having a high-velocity handgun was obvious: greater penetration, more likely to hit a target at long range due to flatter trajectory, etc. It was common for people to ask firearm-related questions and have the answers printed in Outdoor Life. In this instance, it was a deputy sheriff who asked a number of questions. He wanted to know how the 38 Colt military model he owned compared to the 9mm Luger as far as accuracy and penetration goes. I had to edit out a bit of the response because of how long it was. Regardless, the answer given by Townsend Whalen was that the new 38 Super Colt is the best pistol for self-defense, considering it was more powerful and more accurate than the 9mm. It is common for people to believe that simply because someone is in law enforcement, they must automatically have some kind of insight into what the correct firearm is best for their job. Clearly, this is a fallacious and incorrect perspective given the evidence here. The deputy sheriff in this case seems to be using firearms that he bought with his own money, which is fairly common in this era. If there was a law enforcement periodical, or literally anyone in his department that could give him an informed and detailed advice about the subject, then he would not have to resort to writing to a sportsman's magazine for answers. Law enforcement of this era actually lacked an effective institution of their own that would help educate the average officer or deputy on this type of subject. If our deputy did not see any advertisement in law enforcement periodicals for the 38 Super, obviously it would not cross his mind to ask about it. The deputy also mentions that the police there use 3220 revolvers, to which Townsend Whalen replies that 3220 is inferior in every way compared to the 38 Special. Clearly, if these police officers were concerned about ammunition that can penetrate through automobiles, they would be carrying a more effective handgun for the task. After all, it is their lives on the line. Similarly, the Michigan troopers had a handgun shooting contest in which you were allowed to use any service revolver or pistol provided it was at least 3220 caliber. Since the point of this contest was to help the troopers get more skilled with their weapons for actual gunfights, the 3220 must be considered to be the very minimum caliber for a gunfight, or at least according to the organizers of this event. It seems likely to me that the previously mentioned local police department may have been aware that the 3220 was not a particularly good cartridge for accuracy, power, etc. However, given the general lack of communication between officers about firearms-related matters, I seriously doubt that they were particularly informed or concerned about the 3220's performance when shot into steel. Similarly, they likely had little understanding of its effectiveness against unarmored flesh unless they happened to also hunt small animals like rabbits with their revolvers. Most handgun caliber comparisons were still done with pine boards at this time. From the newspaper articles I have read, it seems to me that the two major improvements common for police departments at this time was to buy Thompsons and body armor. This makes sense because Thompsons were much more effective in a serious firefight than handguns were. Likewise, body armor significantly improved your survivability. So new handguns would probably be of secondary importance for a department, but this may have been of greater priority for individual officers, especially if they were issued a weapon that was unimpressive in power or reliability. Another person wrote in stating that he would soon become a member of the Chicago Police Department and that he wanted to know what make and caliber revolver would be best for a policeman. Again, I give a slightly redacted response from Townsend Whalen. Whalen explains that 38 special revolvers are generally satisfactory for police work because they are not as hard or expensive to learn how to shoot as more powerful cartridges are. He says that it will almost always stop or disable the criminal, usually wounding instead of killing, which is often desirable for a police cartridge. He also states that it is best to learn to practice to use a .22 revolver first. He concludes by saying that our soon-to-be officer should not choose an auto-loading pistol instead of a revolver, for the reason that they take far more expensive practice to become decently familiar with them, and you can't get the first shot off as quickly as you could with a good revolver. This advice is obviously flawed. Learning how to use a pistol does not require any more shooting practice than a revolver does. Likewise, if you rely on the grip safety of a pistol like the 1911 and keep a round in the chamber, which I believe was the cavalry's combat carry method, the pistol is in no way inherently slower to fire than a revolver. As for the reliability of semi-automatic handguns, Army testing had found the 1911 to be plenty reliable. The .38 Super was definitely reliable as well, with one person of this era stating that he fired his .38 Super about 500 times with perfect performance. It seems that for a very long time, many people were unwilling to buy semi-automatic handguns because of personal bias. People today will also state that the .38 Super was an inaccurate cartridge compared to the .38 ACP because the feed ramp of the 1911 frame could no longer be used as rim support. This issue was only solved in the modern era by Irv Stone of Barstow Barrels when he redesigned the chamber to allow for head spacing on the case mouth. It is my personal belief that the reason that this problem was not solved sooner was because people were not complaining about the accuracy of the .38 Super when it came out. There was a cartridge that was designed specifically for penetration through the steel of an automobile body in law enforcement situations, and this was the 3844 Smith and Wesson. It was called this because it was effectively a .38 special loaded to higher pressures that was intended to be used in revolvers built on a .44 frame. This cartridge was the result of the collaboration between Elmer Keith and Remington Arms Company. The Remington clean bore ammunition first made for this cartridge was only available with a metal tip because it was intended for a specific police use of penetrating metal and not for any sort of general purpose use. The 3844 became known as the 38 Special High Speed in the 30s, and we would call it the 38 plus P today because generally speaking it was safe to use in your average 38 Special revolvers made by companies like Smith and Wesson or Colt. Therefore, most people today would not consider it to be a caliber that is separate from the 38 Special. The downside of using 3844 in a regular 38 Special revolver would be that the recoil is significantly more, and you wouldn't be very comfortable after shooting this ammunition in a particularly light revolver. A Captain Butts of the NYPD stated that the penetration of the 3844 Remington load is far superior to the ordinary 38 Special. This statement in itself is not inherently surprising or impressive because we are comparing a metal-capped 3844 to what would be presumably a standard unjacketed 38 Special, completely different bullet constructions. The 3844 had 444 foot-pounds of energy, which was 63% more power than an average 38 Special load. As a side note, Harry Butts worked as a ballistics expert for the NYPD before he made captain. This first-hand experience and the observations made during this time likely played a role in his decision to use 3844s when he was promoted. Relevant to this discussion of police ammunition is the Super Police line of ammunition made by the Western Cartridge Company. The assumption behind this type of ammunition was that by using a heavier bullet, you would get more quote-unquote stopping power. If you read the fine print of this advertisement, it talks about how you can have the stopping power of a larger caliber by using Super Police ammunition in your 38. Since the idea of stopping power is often misunderstood, oversimplified, and vague, I will briefly explain that when living creatures are shot with bullets, the bullets cause pressure waves through the fluids of the body which cause a small amount of damage to the central nervous system. I explain this sort of topic in more depth in my other videos. The bottom line here is that it's rare for someone to be immediately incapacitated through this mechanism, and that most people are incapacitated through something like blood loss, which requires time to take effect. One person tested 200 grain round nose 38 specials in 20% ballistics gel and compared them against a standard 158 grain load. What he was looking at specifically was the amount of energy transferred into the gelatin and the corresponding temporary wound cavity. Obviously, this is an outdated technique because we now know that we should be using 10% gelatin and that the temporary stretch cavity of handgun rounds are not particularly important because energy can be lost stretching tissue without permanently damaging it. Regardless, he found that there wasn't any significant difference in the temporary cavity volumes of the 200 grain loads when compared to the 158 grain loads. The most interesting that he found was that when short 2-inch barrels were used, the lower muzzle velocity led to an understabilized bullet that tumbled and did more damage. The author concludes that the reason that the 38 Super Police load disappeared from the CCI Spear factory was because in 1989, 9mm ammunition was being sold at a significantly higher rate than 38 Special, and making 38 Special was obviously less important. 1989 seemed to be a tipping point for a move towards the 9mm that had been building for a while. The British also found out that their 38/200 load used in Webley revolvers would destabilize and tumble in flesh as a result of its high bullet weight and low velocity. The part I have highlighted is a source that states that longer cartridges like the 38 Special could not be used in top break revolvers because of a lack of leverage. Therefore, this is why the British chose the shorter 38 Smith and Wesson cartridge instead of a longer cartridge like the 38 Special. I believe this perspective is demonstrably false. Uberti makes 1873 No. 3 top break revolvers chambered both in 38 Special and in the noticeably longer 45 Long Colt. Therefore, it is definitely possible to make a functioning 38 Special top break. I have quotes from two different books written by the same author that I'm showing here. The one on the top is the earlier book, and it states that the 38/200 load has been proven to be as effective as man-stopper as the heavier 455 Webley cartridge. The lower later quote states that the 38/200 was more efficient in the hands of the average military user than the larger caliber. These are two fundamentally different perspectives. The earlier quote is incorrect, and the author decided to correct this information in the later book. The first issue is that places like Wikipedia still cite the older, incorrect information. The second issue is that in the first book, the author literally said that there were too many sources to itemize. It is because of this lack of transparency that we can't properly investigate statements to see if they are true or false. If you aren't properly citing your sources, that means you aren't taking the subject seriously enough. There are different reasons that people will give as to why the British chose a smaller caliber for their new revolver, yet if we simply look at the training manual for this revolver, we find a different perspective. It's clear that the intent behind this handgun was for it to be rapidly fired without the use of sights, while relying on the alleged stopping power of the ammunition. Therefore, if high fire rate is the goal, this would definitely explain why a smaller cartridge that recoils less would be used. Likewise, the reason that they didn't choose a semi-auto for accomplishing this task is because of a significant preference and tradition for using revolvers. Likewise, the reason that the 38 Smith & Wesson was chosen as the caliber specifically was because Webley & Scott had been already making and selling revolvers in this caliber. Webley & Scott simply made an improved Mark IV version for the military based off of the Mark III version. The 38 caliber revolver was only 105 grams or 3.7 ounces lighter unloaded than the 455 Webley. It makes absolutely no sense to try to replace all the revolvers with new ones if all you get is a slightly lighter version. Assuming that the decision was a rational one, weight was not the primary goal. Going back to the Super Police load, Elmer Keith talks about shooting groundhogs with the standard 38 Special compared to the 38 Super Police. He states that the standard loads only stop the groundhogs with heart, head, or spine shots, and not always with heart shots. In comparison, the Super Police loads did much better, often killing them with lung shots. From the context in this article, he seems to be using a 5-inch barrel for this testing, which in my opinion would be too long and give too much velocity for the ammunition to have the most effective tumble-on-impact effect. I know a fair amount about Elmer Keith, and because of that, I'm not at all inclined to rely on his subjective judgment about effectiveness. Elmer also believes that police departments and individuals have found the standard .38 Special to be lacking sufficient stopping power. Chauncey Thomas, an even older gun writer, steps in to back up what Elmer Keith has said about the .38 Special not always being effective enough. However, he states that a round-nosed .38 Special bullet will not always kill a grouse or rabbit even if the hit is lethal. This is either some sort of convoluted logic or extremely poor sentence structure. By definition, lethal hits must be lethal. I have no doubt that standard round-nosed .38 Special is not particularly impressive, but what I prefer to see is some sort of credible and objective comparison that illustrates this point. We have the rationale given for why the early FBI chose to issue .38 Special revolvers instead of .45 caliber pistols. The issue was raised because the Oklahoma City field office in particular requested .45 caliber pistols. J.M. Keith, the special agent in charge, argues that the .45 is not superior and gives a chart as evidence. The part of the chart labeled .38 Special gives the data for the more powerful .38-44 load instead of the standard .38 Special load. J.M. Keith concludes without evidence that the standard .38 Special loaded with smokeless powder gives better results than the best .45 automatic cartridge. J.M. Keith's conclusion does not stand up to scrutiny. The best .45 has more power, more penetration, and larger bullet diameter than the standard .38 load. My opinion is that J.M. Keith was mistakenly believing that the .38-44 was the standard .38 Special, because this is the only way that he could have come to the conclusion that the .38 Special was better than the .45 Auto listed on his chart. Also during this era, a civilian mentioned that he used a 1911 for hunting. What was interesting about this was that he used full metal jackets with a split nose or cut nose to make them expand. Presumably they were reliable or he wouldn't be using them. You would not even be able to make the argument that a .38 wad cutter with its increased damage over the standard round-nosed .38s would be better than a full metal jacket .45. Modern tests with animal tissue and ballistics gel have demonstrated that a .45 full metal jacket makes a wound roughly .48 caliber in diameter, and unless you have a .38 bullet that either tumbles or expands, the .45 will simply be better. It was believed at this time that the .38 Special Police Positive revolver loaded with Elmer Keith style bullets had more shock power, aka damage, than a .45 ACP. I seriously doubt that this belief holds true in actual flesh. Regardless, because of this belief, it appears that the FBI issued Keith-style .38 Special ammunition at the time. People at the FBI came to this conclusion because of Army testing, and it is entirely likely that the Army was using a substance that did not properly represent tissue, and this led them to false conclusions about bullet effectiveness. This is a chart of all the ammunition that was being provided to the different FBI field offices. They had .30-06 ammunition for the Colt Monitors, based off the Browning BAR. They had single-aught buckshot for Winchester and Remington shotguns, based off the Browning Auto 5. They had .38 Special mid-range wad cutter ammunition for practice, and as far as I know, the standard .38 service load was Keith-style bullets. They also had .45 ACP ammunition for Thompson submachine guns. .38 Special, .45 ACP, and single-aught buckshot are all not particularly good at penetrating through barriers. The Colt Monitor in .30-06 was good at penetrating through barriers, but was generally inappropriate for their purposes due to its weight, bulk, and danger to bystanders from stray rounds. Therefore, it was not used as much as the other weapons. From a logistical level, it would make more sense to issue handguns that take the same ammunition as your submachine guns. However, from a tactical perspective, it would make more sense to choose a handgun that has the capability to penetrate through barriers, since none of the other weapons that you are using most of the time can do this. Consequently, we have letters from 1934 that tell us that agents were being trained and issued both .38 Specials and .38 Super handguns. .45 pistols were also issued in certain areas as well.